This is an article titled Proletarian Leadership by Cornelius Castoriadis. It says that it was originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie in July 1952. Revolutionary activity of the type inaugurated by Marxism is dominated by a profound antinomy that may be defined in the following terms. On the one hand, this activity is founded upon a scientific analysis of society, upon a conscious perspective on future development, and consequently upon a partial planning of its attitude towards reality. On the other hand, the most important factor, the decisive factor for this perspective and for this anticipation on the future is the creative activity of tens of millions of people as it will blossom during and after the revolution. The revolutionary and cosmogonic character of this activity consists precisely in the fact that its content will be original and unforeseeable. It is vain to try to resolve this antinomy by suppressing one of its terms. To renounce rational, organized, planned collective activity because the masses will resolve all problems in the process of their struggle is in fact to repudiate the, quote, scientific, end quote, aspect, and more precisely the rational and conscious aspect of revolutionary activity. It is to sink voluntarily into a messianic mysticism, not to recognize the original and creative character of the masses' activity or to pay it only lip service. On the other hand, amounts to laying the theoretical foundations for bureaucracy, whose ideological basis is the recognition of a, quote, consciousness, end quote. Whose ideological basis is the recognition of a, quote, conscious, end quote, minority as the repository of historical reason. This antinomy appears most conspicuously on the terrain where we encounter problems relating to the revolutionary program and the question of the leadership of the proletariat, the party, and its relations with the working class, is a programmatic question par excellence. Unquestionably, everything that could be said about the limited and unsatisfactory character of the efforts to resolve the party question, made both by our group as well as by other currents during the last 20 years, boils down to the impossibility of resolving this antinomy a priori. For we have here the very kind of an antinomy that cannot be resolved on the theoretical level. Any attempt at a solution can lead only to mystifications, whether they are deliberate or not. The sole theoretical, quote, answer, end quote, that can be given consists in saying that the solution of this antinomy will develop during the course of the revolution because the creative activity of the masses is a conscious and rational type of activity, and hence is essentially homogeneous with the activity of conscious minorities acting before the revolution begins, but whose unique and irreplaceable contribution consists of an overthrow and a tremendous enlargement of the very content of this historical reason. If in this way a general basis is granted us to merge the, quote, consciousness, end quote, of minorities with the, quote, rudimentary, end quote, reason of the masses, if we thus affirm that the revolution does not encounter any insoluble contradictions, we cannot in return pretend that we have discovered in advance the practical concrete forms of this fusion. This theoretical, quote, solution, end quote, does not prescribe them to us. On the contrary, it tells us that the concrete content of the revolution already outstrips every advanced analysis, since it consists in the positing of new forms of historical rationality. It is therefore essential for a revolutionary organization to have a clear awareness of the problem in these terms, and to make itself ready to adapt its ideology and action in the light of the perspective that results therefrom, rather than trying at all costs to resolve by artificial means a question that is on the scale of the revolution and of the revolution alone. We know indeed those instances in which, quote, solutions, end quote, have been given in a different spirit, where they have led. These remarks are in no way aimed at repudiating research and discussion. nor are they opposed to adopting provisional solutions which are more than working hypotheses and are genuine postulates for action. To renounce these would signify the renunciation of every programmatic conception that is defined even a little bit, which amounts to saying that we should give up on all action. The importance of the preceding distinction lies in the fact it gives us a precise understanding of every a priori programmatic conception that we might elaborate, and especially in the fact that it tends to educate the, quote, conscious and organized minority, end quote, about the meaning and the historical limits of its role. The problem is posed in relatively different terms when it is a question of the forms of organization and of the activity of this conscious minority itself. In this case, this minority has to provide itself with its own solutions. A revolutionary minority or an isolated revolutionary militant acts under his own responsibility. Otherwise, he ceases to exist. We cannot claim today to have settled the question of proletarian power except in the form of a postulate. We can and should answer the problem of our tasks and our general orientation. But we can and should answer the problem of our tasks and our general orientation. Obviously, one of the most important aspects of the problem has to do with the connection between the organization and actual activity of a revolutionary minority and its ultimate point of view concerning proletarian power. The actual solution must be in keeping with the line of development that defines our historical outlook. Later in this essay, we will look at the implications of this aspect of the problem. Leadership before and after the revolution. The problem of revolutionary leadership presents itself as a knot of contradictions. The revolutionary process itself in the form of an indefinite number of persons engaged in an indefinite number of activities. Unless we appeal to magic, it is impossible for this process to achieve its goal without a leadership in the precise sense of this term, i.e. without a central organ, instance, that orients and coordinates this manifold of activities, chooses the most economical means for attaining the assigned objectives, etc. On the other hand, the revolution's basic goal is the suppression of the fixed and stable distinction, and eventually of every distinction between directors and executants. Therefore, there is a need for leadership just as there is a need for the suppression of leadership. The final goal of the revolution does not immediately imply the suppression of the distinction between the functions of direction and execution. Here we have a far-off problem that we will not consider. But it does necessarily imply the suppression of a social division of labor corresponding to these functions. If it is granted that the functions of direction cannot be suppressed immediately, one readily derives the following conclusion. The proletariat itself should be its own leadership. The leadership of the class, therefore, cannot be distinct from the class itself. On the other hand, it is obvious that the class cannot immediately and directly be its own leadership. It is useless to debate this point, since in any case the class in fact is not its own leadership, and has not been in the course of its history. If, therefore, the revolutionary process begins in capitalist society, if explicit class struggle has a positive value and ought to be conducted in a permanent, ongoing fashion, it has to be a fraction of the class, a relatively distinct body that can and should be its leadership. The leadership of the class cannot not be distinct from the class itself. The solution to this contradiction is to be found in part over time, i.e. in its development. When we speak of the suppression of the distinction between directors and executants, we are referring to a later stage, roughly the period following the victory of revolution. The suppression of exploitation and the development of the forces of production are indeed impossible without workers' management. And workers' management is inseparable from the power of mass organs. When we speak in contrast of the necessity of a leadership distinct from the class, we are referring to the conditions of the present system of exploitation, under which these functions can be fulfilled only by a minority of the class. But it also is obvious that this answer does not close the question. For the passage from one situation to the other, from the stage during which the exploited, alienated, and mystified class cannot be its own leadership, to the stage during which the class necessarily directs itself, appears as, and in reality is, a leap, an absolute contradiction. This is a contradiction that, let it be said parenthetically, is no more remarkable than the revolution itself, nor than every moment during which a thing ceases to be itself in order to become another thing. It is impossible to explain in advance, in theoretical terms, how this passage will take place. For Marxism, it was never a question of deducing the revolution, but rather of making it. One second. This does not mean that for us the recognition of the possibility of this passage is an act of faith. Without trying to or being able to describe the form it might take, we think we can provide a foundation for this passage upon elements that exist now. The first and most important of these elements is the development of the consciousness and capacities of the proletariat, as it has been shaped by the very evolution of society. The second is the existence within the proletariat long before the revolution of strata and individuals who become aware of the goals and the means of the revolution. The third of these elements is the very action of the revolutionary leadership under the present system of exploitation, which continually has to aim at developing the proletariat's capacity for autonomous action and self-leadership. The proletariat's passage from the position of the exploited class to the position of the dominant class corresponds to the transitional phase usually called the revolutionary period. In our definition, this period begins the moment the working class starts to form mass organizations that take up positions on the field of struggle for power. It ends the moment power has been won on a universal scale. This definition allows us to see exactly where the problem of class leadership is situated, certainly not before the inception of this period, nor after its end. Not beforehand, because there is no problem of class self-leadership if the class does not pose the problem itself. And it only poses the problem through the constitution of mass organs. Not afterward, because the reasons that previously rendered class self-leadership impossible have been suppressed by the victory of the revolution, otherwise they never would have been suppressed. A fucking flopping around cicada over there. It's so goddamn loud. Maybe you can hear it. I don't like things that fly. Little projectile things, like fucking bugs flying in your face. It fucking wigs me out every time. Certainly, it is during this period that the question of the relations between the proletarian leadership and the working class becomes decisive. Just as certainly the discussion of this question serves no purpose today. The constitution of a revolutionary leadership under the present system of exploitation is in no way opposed to the suppression of every separate type of leadership during the post-revolutionary period. We think, on the contrary, that it constitutes one of its presuppositions. From this point of view, everything depends upon the spirit, the orientation, and the ideology in which this leadership is developed and educated, and the manner in which it conceives its relations with the class and actualizes them. Moreover, this leadership in the pre-revolutionary period is a leadership that directs only in a special sense. It proposes objectives and means, but it can impose them only through ideological struggle and its own example. In this sense, the question is not whether there should be leadership, but what its program ought to be. During the revolutionary period, in contrast, everything takes place on the plane of the relations of force. A self-organized and coherent minority will play a very heavy role in the unfolding events. It will be able, and who can state in advance that in certain cases it ought not to act on its own responsibility, imposing its point of view by means of violence? Are there in the group some people for whom the difference between 49% and 51% is the difference between good and evil? Or who will require a pan-proletarian referendum in order to decide upon the insurrection? It then would be a leadership in the whole sense of the term. On the other hand, there will be the working class as a whole, organized and probably armed. If the leadership has been developed upon correct programmatic principles, if the class is sufficiently conscious and active, the revolution will signal the leadership's reabsorption into the class. In the contrary instance, and in any case, if the class abdicates its responsibility to the leadership or to whomever else, then bureaucratization or defeat is inevitable. And the question whether the new bureaucracy will be the formerly revolutionary leadership or some other group matters little. As for the leadership, it can do nothing more than educate itself and the vanguard of the spirit of developing the autonomous activity of the working class as well as its historical awareness. New section. Revolutionary leadership under the present system of exploitation. If the problem of revolutionary leadership is posed for us as a permanent problem, which does not mean that it is always resolved, still less that it is so in an adequate manner, there are two reasons for this. On the one hand, we recognize that the class struggle is itself permanent. On the other hand, and above all, we recognize that the proletariat cannot exist and continue as a revolutionary class without conducting or constantly tending to conduct an explicit, overt struggle. In this struggle, it affirms itself as a separate class with its own historical goals, which are in fact universal ones. As is well known, the character of proletarian struggle differentiates the proletariat from the other exploited classes that have preceded it in history. Now, once this struggle becomes explicit, the problem of the leadership of this struggle is posed. What does leadership mean? It means to decide upon the orientation as well as the methods of a collective action, of the action of a collectivity or a group. Leadership is this directing activity itself. It is also, and this is what matters here, the subject of this activity, the body or organ that brings this activity to bear. This subject can be the group or collectivity in question. It can also be a particular body inside or outside the group acting by, quote, delegation, end quote, or on its own. In both cases, the notion of leadership is tied to the notion of power, for the enforcement of leadership decisions can be guaranteed only through the existence of sanctions and therefore of organized coercion. Leadership in the full sense of the term, therefore, can be exercised only by a dominant class or portions thereof. This will be true when the proletariat is in power, and we have seen that a particular problem arises during the revolutionary period as a result of the fragmentation of power or because of the generalized possibility of using violence that characterizes this period. Under such conditions, what can the leadership of an oppressed and exploited class be? Given the absolute character of violence in present-day society, and in contrast to what could occur in other times in caste societies, for example, coercion cannot be used inside the class unless whoever exercises this power already participates in one manner or another in the system of exploitation, as in the case with reformist or Stalinist trade unions and parties. Thus, agreement between the leadership and the class, or portions of the class, can only be based upon the class's voluntary adherence to the leadership's decisions, the sole, quote, corrective, end quote, means at this leadership's disposal. In the wider sense of the term, it's ideological coercion, i.e. struggle by means of ideas and by example. It would be stupid to try to set limits on this struggle and on this kind of, quote, coercion, end quote. The sole restrictions that can be put upon them concern their ideological content and consequently raise a different set of questions. Under a system of exploitation, a revolutionary leadership, therefore, can have no other meaning than the following: a body that decides on the orientation and methods of action of the class or portions thereof, and strives to get these methods adopted by the class through ideological struggle and exemplary action. The question now is raised, is such a leadership really necessary, not in the sense of directing activity, which goes without saying, but in the sense of a particular subject who directs? Cannot the class immediately and directly be its own leadership? The answer, obviously, is no. Under the conditions of the present system of exploitation, the class cannot, in its undifferentiated totality, be its own leadership. If we must, we will go over again the overwhelming set of reasons arguing for this conclusion. The leadership cannot be thought of in any other way than a universal, minoritarian, selective, and centralized organ. These are the classic characteristics of the party, though the name is of little importance. But the present age has added to these characteristics a new and still more basic one. The party is an organ whose form and substance are unique. In other words, it is the sole permanent class organ under the conditions of the present system of exploitation. This is not and cannot be a plurality of organizational forms juxtaposed to one another or superimposed upon each other. In particular, it is impossible for organizations that supposedly are trying to respond to economic problems as particular problems, trade unions, to be proletarian organs. The politico-economic organ for the struggle against exploitation is unitary and unique. In this sense, the distinction between party and, quote, committees of struggle, end quote, or any other minoritarian organizational form of the vanguard of the working class is concerned exclusively with the degree of clarification and organization and nothing else. The exclusive character of this directing organ is clearly apparent under the most modern conditions of the system of exploitation, bureaucratic dictatorship, or war regime. Conditions under which a plurality of organizational forms or forms of leadership is unthinkable. But it is obvious, even under the, quote, superannuated, end quote, conditions of the Western world. Indeed, neither from the point of view of the problems involved nor from that of the persons concerned can one try to create on a permanent basis a, quote, factory, end quote, organization and a, quote, political, end quote, organization separate and independent from each other. From this perspective, the distinction between the, quote, organization of the workers, end quote, and the, quote, organization of revolutionaries, end quote, ought to disappear along with the theoretical conception that is its root. Constitution of a leadership group in the present period. Of the three elements required to constitute a leadership group, program, organizational form, actual basis for constituting the group, it is the last one, i.e. the existence and the present nature of a potential vanguard, that ought to be of particular concern. Unless we are mistaken, no comrade has questioned till now whether it is possible to define a program or whether there might be an organizational form corresponding to the content of this program and to the conditions of the present era. In contrast, there is a controversy not so much about the nature of the existing, quote, vanguard, end quote, as about that vanguard's historical evaluation and signification. The concrete definition of the existing, quote, vanguard, end quote, on which the entire group is more or less in accord, is that it includes all of the workers who are conscious of the nature of capitalism and Stalinism as systems of exploitation and who refuse to prop up either one by their actions. Even more profoundly, and in particular with respect to Stalinism, these workers are calling into question the entire set of problems concerning both the goals and means of working class struggle. As has long been said in the group, the attitude of this vanguard is in essence negative and critical. As such, it undeniably signifies a kind of transcending. The whole question is, a transcending of what? In our opinion, it is a transcending of the traditional meaning of the, quote, program, end quote, of traditional organizational forms, and in particular of traditional forms of activity of, quote, leadership groups, end quote. This is so as regards its objective value. No doubt its concrete content goes much further. Almost certainly these workers as a whole not only reject the traditional solution to these problems, but challenge the idea that there can be a general solution. In other words, it is certain that they do not believe at the present time in the proletariat's ability to become the dominant class. We can draw a conclusion about what is at the bottom of these Can we draw a conclusion about what is at the bottom of these problems? Perhaps, but then we must draw out the entire line of argument. If the workers who are relatively more conscious believe at the present time that every leadership group is sure to turn rotten, and if this by itself proves that it really is the case, the same line of argument can be used to prove that every program is a mystification, or that the proletariat never will be capable of exercising real power. For that, too, is what workers think. In reality, this state of consciousness and the attitude resulting from it reflect a new and immensely positive awareness of the bankruptcy of traditional answers, and as such, they undeniably prepare the way for the future. But they equally reflect the world situation, and in particular the incredible, unprecedented pressure that the current relation of forces exerts on all individuals in society, including the members of our group. And to this extent, they represent, so to speak, the pure and simple weight of historical matter that indeed is rapidly becoming transformed, and that before long will sink into the past. As long as the vanguard is situated on this terrain, the question of constituting a leadership certainly cannot be posed as a practical task. We must wait for the pressure of objective conditions to put again before the most conscious workers the necessity of acting. Role and tasks for the group. Role and tasks for the group. This does not mean at all that the group does not now have a role to play, a historically important role. At the present time, only the group can, and unless we are mistaken, it is the only one in the world to do it, carry on with the elaboration of a revolutionary ideology, define a program, and do the work of propagating ideas and educating. These are quite valuable activities, even if the results do not appear immediately. The accomplishment of these tasks is a basic presupposition for the constitution of a leadership, once the latter becomes objectively possible. It is not difficult to comprehend these things, and it would be surprising if these points became an object of discussion on their own. If nevertheless they do, it is because the group is not a logical subject, because it is made up of individuals who belong to the same society we analyze so well for others, and because these individuals experience the same tremendous historical pressure as is currently bearing down so hard upon the working class and its vanguard. The great majority of the comrades in the group consciously or unconsciously share the same state of mind described earlier, and it is likely that they no longer understand very well their reasons for sticking with the group. As a consequence, their participation in the work of the group is almost nil, which threatens to make the work of the group and the group itself disappear. But this phenomenon and the conclusions following from it belong to another discussion. Even if the, quote, party discussion, end quote, led to some conclusions about these or other kinds of tasks, there still would have to be comrades willing to sacrifice something so that these tasks, whatever they might be, could be accomplished. Postface. Discussion of the organizational question went on, in more or less pointed fashion, during the entire history of the Socialisme ou Barbarie group. But the meaning of the two preceding texts, the Revolutionary Party and Proletarian leadership, would remain obscure if they were not placed in the context of the discussion going on at the time they were written. In order to shed some light on them, it seems to me useful to reprint here the accompanying notes published in Socialisme ou Barbarie 2, May 1949, and 10, July 1952. Here first is the note that preceded the Revolutionary Party in issue 2. The life of our group. The life of our group, which is an article, summarizes the various positions taken by members of the group during an all-day plenary session on the question of the Revolutionary Party. Here follows the resolution statutaire, to which the preceding note referred. This it's confusing here. The editor's throwing some shit at me. This 9-point resolution on the bylaws appears on page 173 to 75 of EMO 1. The preceding discussion, itself the apparent culmination of discussions that in fact had begun before the group left the PCI, which would be the International Communist Party or something like that of France, was a Trotskyist group, not PCI as in the sense of Italian Communist Party. A little afterward, however, it was taken up again stronger than ever, reaching a climax in the spring of 1951 and concluded at least temporarily with the first decision of Claude Lefort and other comrades who shared his view, a decision that was in fact of short duration. The texts that entered into the discussion were Proletarian Leadership, which is reprinted here, in Les Proletariat et les problèmes de la direction révolutionnaire by Claude Lefort, which also was published in issue 10 of Socialisme or Barbarie, and reprinted in Claude Lefort, Éléments d'un... I don't know if I fucking say any of this shit. What the hell? Who am I fooling? I'm about to cut this shit off, dude. There's nothing, fuck this. Postface is over in a fucking disorganized and scattered way, and I'm not going to read it.